Hello everyone, I'm really pleased to be part of this hybrid fitness summit. Today I've got a small presentation for you which I've titled The Fundamentals of Fitness Racing. Before we get into that, I'll briefly introduce myself. My name is Jason Curtis. I'm a strength and conditioning coach from the UK. I've owned a strength and conditioning gym now for around 10 years. Prior to that, I was an Army Physical Training Instructor. I published around 20 books on strength and conditioning, so warming up, strength training, Olympic weightlifting and things like that. And I have an academy which qualifies personal trainers and S&C coaches worldwide. And finally, I'm a race director of my own race, so founder and race director of the Deadly Dozen, which takes place on athletics tracks. And it's quite a horrendous race, 1,200-meter runs and 12 exercise stations in between. So now that I've introduced myself, let's get into the presentation. I've got a PowerPoint presentation that I've put together. I won't be winning any awards for graphic design. And also, little caveat to start, while I'm setting up this slideshow, I put quite a lot of information into the slides. I'll save it as a PDF. If anyone wants, a free copy, just send me a message and I'll send it across. So some of them are a little bit text heavy, so don't worry if you don't get a chance to read it all. Some of it I'll literally read out loud and go from there. So starting off on the first slide, what is fitness racing? So obviously there's many ways that we can define this. I'm sure many people watching this presentation will have their own definitions, but this is how I define it. So fitness racing is a sport where athletes race through a series of physical activities as an individual or team. These activities can include running, rowing, and other modes of cardio, bodyweight exercises, lifting and carrying weights, and maneuvering over obstacles. So I consider there to be two categories of fitness racing. And this is just my opinion. So if you disagree, let me know, send me a message and tell me I'm right or wrong. So the first one is a term I've coined, which is conventional fitness racing. So these are races with low technicality. Then there's specialist fitness racing. So races with moderate to high technicality. So an example of a specialist fitness race to me would be CrossFit or even OCR with the technical rigs, ninja sports, stuff like that. So yes, CrossFit can involve anything, which I do agree that you can argue that the winner of the CrossFit Games is the fittest person on earth because it can involve anything. So it's a worthy title. However, it does tend to lean into barbell Olympic weightlifting and gymnastic type movements like handstand walking and muscle ups. So if you were to take the average person off the street that might well be one of the fittest people on earth, you take people from different sports and say, right, we've got footballers, we've got runners, we've got athletes of any sport you can think of, and we're going to throw them into a fitness race. There's quite a high barrier if there is some of these high technical activities. So even if that person has the best aerobic fitness, the best muscular strength, and the best muscular endurance in the world, there might be some movements that they're just not technically proficient at, and therefore they're at a disadvantage. Conventional fitness racing, on the other hand, has low technicality. So it's things like Hyrox, Deca, My Race, the Deadly Dozen. So the idea behind these races, although there has to be some strength barrier to entry, because otherwise you'd be just using paper weights or everything would be body weight, there's a low strength barrier to entry and there's a low technical barrier to entry. So it really is that sport for everybody. So they're the two categories that I've come up with. So for me, there are 6 components of a fitness race. So the first one is cardio, and I'd love to hear opinions on what other people think on these points. So the cardio refers to the cardiovascular activities within a race. So for example, running, rowing, skiing, cycling. Then we've got the muscular endurance component. That refers to the body weight and submaximal resistant exercises that are performed for longer durations, so high reps. We've got strength. So I use this to refer to the heavy, so it's near max resistance exercises, which you see in some fitness races that might have a strength zone where it might be work up to a 3-rep max or a 1-rep max, or it might just be a maximal snatch, rather than it being coming up to a kettlebell deadlift and you've got to perform 100 reps. You've got speed, and this refers to how much emphasis is placed on speed. It might be a short obstacle course. It might be a race that is just like one of the Decas, which is much shorter. Sometimes it skips. I need to remember to pause the slide because it gets ahead of me because I'm slow and like to waffle on. So the speed is how much of an emphasis is there on speed? Obviously, if you're running 5K between exercise stations, it's not going to have a real emphasis on speed, where if it was 100 meters between exercise stations, it's going to have more of a speed emphasis. Technicality, which is, for me, the defining difference between what's conventional fitness racing and specialist fitness racing. Specialist fitness racing requires you to have some form of specialism. Now, obviously, a CrossFit competition might not require any of that. However, you could rock up or turn up on the day and have to do muscle ups or have to do handstand walking. So it requires a little bit more specialist training. Novelty, finally, this refers to additional aspects of a race that are designed to be fun, scary, arduous, etc. For example, slides into water or inflatable obstacle courses. So I think that's it's always a variable of fitness that people forget about is fun and enjoyment. Fun and enjoyment sort of nurtures consistency, which is ultimately the number one variable. So now we've talked about the sort of components of what a fitness race is. We're going to now talk about the components of physical fitness. It's what we refer to as performance qualities. As strength conditioning coaches, we also have movement qualities like squat, hinge, lunge. So we've got muscular strength, obviously the ability to overcome a resistance, so to produce maximal force. And there's lots of different types of strength, like rate of force development, elastic or reactive strength. We're not going to go too deep into these. We've got mechanical strength. There's muscular endurance, which is obviously key for fitness racing. All of these are key in some way, you could argue. Cardiorespiratory endurance, aerobic, anaerobic fitness. Like I say, these components here can all be broken down further and further and further. You've got mobility and flexibility. You're not going to be able to achieve a adequate depth on your squat during a wall ball if you've not got mobility. Body composition plays a role in terms of if you're too heavy, if you're taller, you're shorter, things like that. That's more to do with anthropometrics. Agility, balance, coordination. Obviously, you need technique, and you don't want to be falling over when you're running. You've got speed, power, and reaction time and quickness, which is, maybe a little bit more nuanced. So we'll go to the next slide. Now we've talked about those. Now, this is something I wanted to throw in because it's quite an interesting concept that I've used with lots of sports. So it's what I refer to as a performance triangle. Now, I put max force in the bottom left corner, max velocity in the bottom right, and endurance in the top. So as you go from the bottom left corner of max force, as you climb up the pyramid, you're going through sort of power endurance and muscular endurance. And then on the right-hand side, you've got max velocity, which is speed. And as you climb up towards endurance, you've got speed endurance. So this is quite a cool illustration if you want to place your sort of marker for your sport, whether it be rugby, tennis, cricket, or whether it's high rocks, whether it's the DECA, whether it's another fitness race, whether it's a certain form of CrossFit workout, whether it be Murph or Fran or something like that. Sort of, it's a great way to illustrate what the demands of that sport is. So as an S&C coach, what we always do is we have a needs analysis first, where we analyze again, not paused it, where we analyze the waffling on as I do. We analyze the needs of the sport and the needs of the athlete. We then establish a testing battery, which is going to give us objective data. It's going to give us information about how fit they are, like their aerobic fitness, how strong they are, how fast they are. And we can use that to profile the athlete, see what their strengths and weaknesses are, see what needs developing, rather than just giving someone a single program and saying, there you go. We need to test it objectively. So we have some subjective measures, asking people how they feel, the RPE scale, rating of perceived exertion, how did that feel out of 10? But we also need objective measures like a maximal aerobic speed test. For example, a 2K run. We have 1 rep max test or 3 rep max test to establish strength. And that's where we can look, well, this athlete's quite aerobically fit, but they're not very strong. Or they're really strong, but they're struggling on the aerobic fitness side. And that paints the picture of what we need to lean into during the programming. And we don't just want to develop weaknesses, we also want to lean into our strengths and create a well-rounded program. Often what you'll read in articles when it comes to fitness racing and sport is, this is the key to be a good fitness racer. Now, some people will say zone 2 training, low intensity cardio, lots of it is the key to be a good fitness racer. But that's not necessarily the key if you're already an ultra athlete that's done all the zone 2 in the world and you've never been in the gym and done strength. For you, strength training might be the key. Now, if you've come from a strength sport background, you're a power lifter and you're wanting to get into a fitness race like Deca, Deadly Dozen, or High Rocks, then zone 2 is likely the key to build that aerobic base, but fundamentally it comes down to your individual needs, because we have natural strengths and weaknesses because of genetics and what we've lent into in our training history. You know, realistically, it's our training history that dictates the direction that we need to go. So this is just a cool illustration, and feel free to grab it. If you want a JPEG or PNG of that image, I can send it across. So let's go to the next slide. Quickly pause it because I'm sure I'll waffle on again. So I've talked briefly about what fitness races need. Now, fundamentally, during a race, during a conventional fitness race, so we're talking something that's lasting, 30 to 90 minutes, or let's say around the hour, an hour and 20 minutes or so, then the key qualities that are working during that race generally, and conventional fitness racing could be described as, one big circuit training session, load of different activities, some resistant activities, some cardio activities. Then aerobic power and muscular endurance are absolutely key. They're the things that are working, because if you're working for an hour, you're not working anaerobically. Now, all the energy systems are working at once, and we are going to go on to a little bit of info on energy systems, hopefully without boring everyone. So aerobic power is our ability. We're still working aerobically, so we're not producing too many waste products. We're not fatiguing to an excessive point, but we're working as fast as we can. So it's producing that energy fast while primarily being aerobic, so we're not dying. And then there's muscular endurance, because for the most part, our muscles are having to contract time and time again. So they're the two qualities that are key for fitness races. However, that doesn't mean that we just train them specifically. The foundation of aerobic power, so having a powerful aerobic system and aerobic fitness, is aerobic capacity. So we want to build a big base. And we've always got to think about recovery cost when it comes to physical training, because if we train really hard, it has a higher recovery cost. Now, we know if we want to develop our aerobic system and the mitochondria, them little power plant cells within the body, we're not going to go too deep into the sort of physiology of that. But if we want to develop the systems that allow us to be aerobically fit, we know we need a lot of volume of exercise. So we need a lot of it. So we've got volume is how much, intensity is how hard, and frequency is how often. So we need lots of volume and in turn quite a bit of frequency. Now, obviously, we can't have too much intensity with a lot of volume. They've got an inverse relationship. As volume goes up, intensity's got to go down. As intensity goes up, volume goes down. So to get the volume of exercise in to develop the aerobic base, then we're best working at a lower intensity. And therefore, that's why you'll hear the term zone 2 all the time. Comfortable exercise, you're able to hold a conversation, and you're just building up that aerobic base. Some endurance athletes will use what's called an 80-20 split. 80% of their training is the low intensity, and 20% is much higher. And a lot of the time, they don't sort of mince around in the middle zones, where they feel that they can get the benefit, the adaptation from the lower intensity without the recovery cost of the sort of moderate intensity. And then they want the high intensity to get all the benefits. Now, on the other end of the scale, from the aerobic power, we've got the muscular endurance, so the ability for the muscles to keep contracting. Obviously, that's fueled by the aerobic system and the anaerobic systems. But the foundation of our muscles' ability to keep contracting is obviously having muscular strength. So the ability to produce a lot of force. If you could train muscular endurance all you like, but if you don't develop muscular strength, then what are considered light weights will feel heavy for you, and therefore your muscles are having to contract much, and they're going to have to exert themselves much harder on every rep, and you'll just burn out. So there's always going to be a foundation of aerobic capacity and muscular strength. And in any well-rounded fitness racing program, you want sessions that just focus on building zone 2, a base of cardiovascular fitness, muscular strength, so lower rep ranges, lifting a little bit heavier. Doesn't mean you have to go balls to the wall every session, but lifting a little bit heavier to encourage more muscular strength. It's said principle, specific adaptation to imposed demands. If you want to get stronger, lift a bit heavier. And that's how you'll develop better muscular endurance. And of course, alongside the zone 2, alongside the strength training, alongside interval training, high intensity cardio work, you also need the circuit training work to develop the muscular endurance. So let's take a slightly deeper look into the energy systems. And I'll be cautious not to go too far into this because there's lots of fancy words like adenosine triphosphate. So adenosine triphosphate is just the molecule that provides us with energy. And the energy systems are essentially just using, like, as humans, we eat food. Our energy systems can convert that food, that fuel, into ATP. Plants use ATP, and they just use the sun photosynthesis. So they're just chemical reactions that we use to produce that molecule there, which I've created a nice little design of, and it produces energy. Now, what happens is the first energy system, the ATP-CP system, there's dozens of names for each of these energy systems, so that's going to be even more confusing, like the creatine phosphate system or the phosphocreatine system. I just call it the ATP-CP system. So that's the first sort of 10 seconds. Again, you'll hear, let's go back to that. You'll hear people debate, oh, is it this long? Is it doesn't really matter. We're not really getting much adaptation from this first system, which is it doesn't require anything. There's no real energy cost to this system. It's just the creatine phosphate that's in the muscles and attaches to the adenosine diphosphate to create the adenosine triphosphate. And it's the quick burst of energy that we get. Then we've got the lactate system, the anaerobic system. This is one of the systems that we're more interested in. This is a very fast system. However, it doesn't last very long. So realistically, this is where we're doing our intervals. If we're doing intervals of sort of 10 seconds through to 2 to 3 minutes. However, it's going to hurt, it's going to tire you out. So it can produce that energy quickly, but it's not going to last long at all. Then the final system, the aerobic system, that can last for hours and hours and hours. So that's an overview of the energy system. Sometimes it can feel a little bit complicated for people, but all we've got to remember really is we've got an aerobic system and an anaerobic system. And when we produce adenosine triphosphate with oxygen within that chemical process, we're producing less waste products. We're producing just carbon dioxide and water, and therefore the muscles are not starting to burn. We're not fatiguing as heavily. Obviously, all these energy systems work together, and that's why even if you are only walking, your muscles will start to tire. You'll start to tire. You know, if you were to, you'd walk yourself to death. Essentially, you'd burn all your fat, and you'd be wasted away. And that's what we do. We reconsume the food, and that gives us the energy to carry on. So going to the next slide, we can see that when it comes to the energy systems, what's important is power, capacity, and utilization. So power is how fast can it produce the energy. So the first energy system, the ATP-CP system, produces it rapidly, but it lasts no time at all. And we're not going to get much adaptation from that system in terms of training. Don't really have to worry about it in that respect. We've got capacity. How long can it produce it for? So first system can produce it really fast. Capacity, terrible. Second system, the anaerobic system or the lactate system, it's got great power, not as good as the first system, but it's got better capacity, much better than the first system, but nowhere near the aerobic system. Now, the aerobic system's got fantastic capacity, but it hasn't got the best power. Now, if we're working for longer durations like we are during a fitness race, as I've mentioned previously, we need to primarily be using the aerobic system. Now, of course, we'll be being thrown into the anaerobic system. That's fine. And that's why, you know, if you go from doing a steady run into pushing a really heavy sled, it's going to throw that heart rate up and you're going to hit that anaerobic system. However, for the most part, we need the aerobic system to be as powerful as possible so we can work as fast as we physically can while still primarily being aerobic. Now, the final point of all this is what we call utilization. Now, utilization is how well we can use that energy. And that fundamentally comes down to technique. So if you were a runner, a good fitness test would not be rolling with a BJJ black belt. No matter how fit you are, you're going to be absolutely exhausted because you haven't got very good technique. You're not proficient. You're not using it well. And that's where technique comes in. And that's where, even if you're very fit on a rower, you want to get the miles on the legs. Any runner will know a lot of it's just miles on legs. You've got to get the tissues used to that activity, specific adaptation to imposed demands. So cyclists, even if two people have got immeasurably the same aerobic fitness with, say, a VO2 max test, a cyclist is generally going to be better on a bike. A runner is generally going to be better at running because there's other factors involved. So let's move on to the next slide. Now, this is key. Again, key illustration is the thresholds. Obviously, at any point, we're hitting thresholds. So at low intensities, we've got low fatigue. And then we hit what's called lactate threshold 1, or the aerobic threshold. So in this green area, we're primarily aerobic, or pretty much we're all aerobic here to make a point. Then as we hit that first threshold, this first line, LT1, we start to use the anaerobic system a little bit, and we start to get a little bit more fatigue. So you can see here, this axis here is fatigue. So as the intensity goes up, the fatigue starts to climb. But then we hit LT2, which is the anaerobic threshold, where the anaerobic system becomes the primary energy source, where we hit the red zone. And as you can see, the fatigue just goes through the roof. So as fitness racers, we are going to be thrown into that red zone, because sometimes you'll get onto a station where you just have to grind. You know, that's the beauty of fitness racing. The race changes. However, if you go too far into this red zone, you won't recover. And a great way to illustrate this is get yourself on a track or get yourself on a ski erg, go as hard as you can for 400 meters, and then try and do a circuit session afterwards. And it will write you off for the entire circuit session. So you've got to be very careful not to get into this red zone too early and not to spend too long in it, because it's not just a case that you might not recover for the next 1 to 2 minutes. It might actually ruin the race because you just can't recover that debt. So this is a great illustration for fitness racers, that if you spend too long in that red zone, the fatigue goes to a point often where you just can't pull it back. So we're coming up to the last slide now. I might actually just double check the time, because I don't want to go too far over and get told off. So I hope that was useful as a whole, a little bit of an introduction of what I consider fitness racing to be. I don't often call it hybrid fitness racing, in all honesty, because fitness is all the components that we went over. So when someone says fit, one of the problems with the fitness industry these days is people either lean into strength or they lean into cardio. They either do loads of running or they do loads of powerlifting and weightlifting. And really, to be fit, that should mean that you're strong, you're fast, you know, you're fit, you're agile, you're all of them things. So I just refer to it as fitness racing. So I just wanted to finish with my top tips for fitness racing. So number 1, build an aerobic base. Low intensity, just layer it on. You know, if you've got a really good training program, think about how you can just layer it on. And my advice to stay away from the injuries is start slow, do less. Less is more, and just layer it on slowly as your soft tissues start to accommodate to the stress. Build a strength base with dedicated strength training sessions is number 2. So lift a little bit heavier. You don't have to risk injury by going too hard. Same again, start steady, build it up. You don't, although it is the said principle, and lifting above 90% of your 1 rep max is going to elicit more strength development, arguably, because you're lifting heavier, you're focusing on them fast twitch muscle fibers. You can still develop incredible strength around 70 to 85% of your 1 rep max. Some of the best strength and conditioning coaches I've worked with worldwide never take their athletes above 85%. You've got to remember that to develop strength, you don't have to act like a strength sport athlete. It just wants to be healthy enough, you know, 8 out of 10 on the RP scale. Number 3, conventional fitness racing is essentially circuit training as a sport. So include sessions that mimic sport, compromise running, build muscular endurance with circuit training. Sometimes people are afraid to do race sims. So race sims, you don't want to overdo them. You will burn out, but don't be afraid to do hard circuit training. You've got to get used to being uncomfortable, and don't be afraid to do circuit training that's almost like zone 2 training, where you're not trying to destroy yourself. Not all circuit training has to be a thrashing. circuit training, in my opinion, is one of the most enjoyable forms of fitness. It's so varied that the injury rates are really low. From what I've seen, 10 years of running multiple circuit conditioning classes a day, injury rates are almost non-existent. Number 4, use a wide variety of training modalities, running, cycling, rowing, circuits, barbell work to minimize your risk of overuse injuries. Managing training loads is fundamentally the key to injury prevention. Remember, 99% of the time, your body will heal itself if you provide adequate recovery. Recovery time doesn't need to be a cessation activity, so an absolute halt to activity. It can just be an adjustment of activity. So if something's hurting, modify what you're doing, allow your body to do what it does best, which is repair itself. Just change the exercise you're doing, take away the aggravators, add in exercises that feel good, and gradually build back the resilience towards the aggravators. It's as simple as that. Obviously, see a medical professional if you're worried about anything. That's just common sense, hopefully. Final racing tip: your race pace is the Goldilocks zone for performance. So remember, learn this in your circuit training sessions. There's a pace that you can get yourself to where it will just carry you through the race. If you go too hard, remember that illustration of that fatigue curve, where as you get into that red zone, it just goes through the roof. Pacing is everything. Train in a way where you're just pushing that race pace higher and higher and higher. But if you try and push too hard and get into that red zone, you're just going to burn yourself out. So that's my presentation. Hopefully you found it useful. Let me see, my clicker's gone missing. I've just finished with a big screen of the Deadly Dozen. And you can find me by searching me on Instagram, Jason Curtis, and you'll find everything else. www.deadlydozen.co.uk is the fitness race website. I've got various other websites myself, jasoncurtis.org. But you'll be able to find me on social media easy enough. Feel free to message me. I give away loads of ebooks. And I'm more than happy to send this PDF if you think it might be useful, and ask me any questions you like, because I'm always happy to answer them. If it takes me a few days to get back, it's just because I tend to get bombarded through my Instagram and whatnot. But I really appreciate you listening, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. I'll stop share and stop.